Hello, I'm Elizabeth Lev, and I wish I could be with you there at the Sheen Center as part of the wonderful exhibition on the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. It's one of my favorite paintings, and I have been to Milan innumerable times in order to explore it. I've even had the good fortune on more than one occasion to be alone with that extraordinary work in that beautiful room. And so I was hoping that if perhaps I can't be with you in person, I could share some of my love for Leonardo's work and why I think The Last Supper is one of the greatest paintings that Christian story has ever conferred on humanity. Now, I'm sure you know that Leonardo da Vinci, who was a Florentine, moved to Milan very early on in order to be able to make his way in the fabulous Sforza court, where we had Ludovico the Moor. And from there, he was commissioned by the Dominican order, with whom Ludovico the Moor would occasionally eat his meals, to paint the Last Supper in the refectory, or the place where the Dominicans would take their meals. Now, this is already a very, very important part of understanding the painting, that the Last Supper would be occupying the wall, mostly an entire wall, in a room full of where these mendicant friars would eat together, listen to spiritual reading while they were eating as part of their daily lives, whether it was breakfast or lunch or dinner. This painting made a backdrop to their daily lives, and it was a huge undertaking for Leonardo, who worked on it basically from about 1495 to 1498, experimenting with interesting types of mural painting in order to get the most out of the colors and the most out of the expressions. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of stories of how the Dominicans were a little frustrated at Leonardo's slow going and his very painstaking way of painting, which would occasionally be just looking at the painting for a little while and then leaving, and then coming back and painting furiously and then leaving. But the result is truly something extraordinary. So this space, this subject matter of the Last Supper was extremely common in refectories. It was sort of the typical thing that virtually any religious order would choose to put in the dining room. In Florence, which is where Leonardo was from, there were versions by Andrea del Castagno, the very first version that we know of by Taddeo Gaddi in Santa Croce, the Franciscan church. Virtually every every refectory had a Last Supper. So the challenge for Leonardo was to make a Last Supper that would be different from all the other ones in Florence and different from anything anybody had ever seen in Milan. And he certainly did that. And you'll hear about the beautiful composition, his way of using one-point linear perspective. So he creates this illusion of a room that's simply an extension of the space of the dining room. The way that all the convergent lines in one-point linear perspective reach the head of Christ. So no matter what we do in the painting, no matter who we try to look at, we always focus in towards the image of Christ. You'll hear about the naturalism when you look at the tablecloth, and you can see the wine and the way the light passes through the glass and stains a little red on the tablecloth. And of course, one of the most interesting things you'll hear about is how Leonardo studied the groups of the faces of the 12 apostles, grouping them very beautifully into groups of three. So you have four groups of three extending outwards from Christ. And so it's in this very structured, very careful, very thoughtful, very mathematical composition that Leonardo composed that he drew out this extraordinary human experience. And he started by choosing a moment. It's safe to say that most of the Last Supper paintings that we can see that are preceding Leonardo's in Florence usually chose just any given moment during the Last Supper, not the sort of intense psychological drama. But Leonardo makes it very clear that he has chosen a very specific moment. You can hear that, you can almost hear the sound effect as Jesus has just said, "One of you will betray me." And when you look at that table, you see the salt and the wine and the bread, and you sort of imagine a busy, bustling table and people talking and chatting, and this sort of strange silence coming from the master. And you can already see this emphasized by the fact that Jesus is separated. He's not, doesn't interact with the rest of the group. He's enclosed in his own triangle. And that at a certain moment, after the apostles are kind of wondering, why isn't he saying anything? Jesus drops this stone. He drops this bombshell in the middle of the dinner. One of you will betray me. And to watch the explosion or the splash or the ripples that take place from those words is what Leonardo sought to capture. Leonardo loved to go and draw water phenomena. He liked to try to draw storms. He liked to draw waterfalls. And imagine the Last Supper as the effect of a stone being dropped into still water, that triangle, that solid triangle of Jesus dropping those words. And then all of the splashes and the ripples in the grouping of the apostles. So you have the first two groups who react very violently, no? We have the spread out arms on the right. You have the figure who's leaning back on the left, this first leaping away from Jesus. And then you move out to the second groups. And the second groups, however, although they interact among themselves, draw your eye through gestures back towards Jesus. So in contemplating that painting, you go from that moment of Jesus' announcement of his betrayal, the first dramatic, startled reactions on the part of the apostles, the denials, the what are you talking about, to the muttering of the men in the outer edges. What do you say? What do you think he's talking about? Why do you think this is happening? And then your eye drawing back to Jesus. You're caught in this continuum that we remember all the time as we think about the Last Supper. The most interesting grouping, of course, is the one that is facing the image of Jesus immediately to the left, which is where Leonardo draws out some of his most extraordinary skills. So the figure of John, who is the closest to Jesus, because we know from the gospel story that he was sleeping by Jesus' side. The sleeping by Jesus' side presumes that they were dining in the posture typical of Roman times. So in ancient Rome, people would have been reclining. But in 15th century Milan, no one's reclining at dinner. So Leonardo had to find a solution in order to put John in such a way that would look like he was sleeping, as if he just shifted slightly away from Jesus' shoulder. So you see John's slowly awakening, shifted off towards the left, and then Peter rushes in. He sort of shoves his way in that kind of way that Peter has, this kind of very aggressive, well, you ask the master who he is. So he goes to John and he goes to tell him, well, he'll answer you, ask the master who it is. And in that gesture, that drama of Peter and the silence of John, a third figure is thrust forward. A third figure is thrust forward, his elbow coming out into our space, spilling the salt, which is actually a clever Italian term for betrayal. You have the figure, the sort of dark, contorted face of Judas. Now, in this figure, Leonardo was building on a very old tradition. The Last Supper we have, for example, in the Sistine Chapel by Cosimo Rosselli. The Last Supper by Ghirlandaio in San Marco. Last Suppers usually put Judas on the side of the table closest to the spectator. So 11 apostles get to be on the side with Jesus, and one apostle sits on our side of the table. And it was always intended to be a way for us to understand. If we're looking at the 12 apostles and trying to identify with one of them, it would be a mistake for us to think that we're a lot like Peter or a lot like John or Matthew. The apostle who we are the closest to through our sinfulness is indeed Judas. So Judas tends to be brought closer to the viewer. Leonardo didn't want Judas on the other side of the table, although in early drawing he tried to put Judas on the other side of the table. Just as in an earlier drawing, he had John resting on. He had John's actually face on the table as if he were taking a nap in kindergarten. So he had these two sort of ideas of trying to figure out how to show sleeping John and Judas on our side of the table, which is the typical way of doing things. But then he changed it. Instead, he put Judas on the opposite side of the table, continuing that beautiful flow of 4 threes. But at the same time, he thrusts Judas out so that Judas is still the one who is closest to us, and even closer to us and discernible to our eye is the bag of coins in his hand. So we see that betrayal of Judas up close, and we become, in many ways, almost complicit in his betrayal. Then we have in the painting, we return to that glorious image of Jesus, who on one hand is this, he's holding the bread and he's opening his hand at the same time. So obviously this refers to who is going to betray him. It's the one who is going to take the sop with me. But on the other hand, the way that Leonardo uses these two gestures, one of Jesus taking that bread, and of course telescoping our mind to the institution of the Eucharist, but also Jesus accepting this sacrifice, that this bread, which is my body, which will be given up for you. So you have him accepting the sacrifice, his hand covering the bread, pulling it towards him, and then his other hand open towards the table, reaching out towards, reminding us that this is the body that will be given up for us. So at the same time, even though Leonardo's not focusing on the moment of the Eucharist, he is focusing very intently on that ultimate sacrifice and that ultimate acceptance of Jesus's death and resurrection, but at the moment of Jesus's imminent suffering. And what is interesting when you are in the room of the Last Supper is that you see directly across from the painting of the Last Supper, there is a painting of the crucifixion. So you literally have Jesus, who is gazing across the way at a painting by Giovanni Donato di Montalfano, a painting that was painted right around the same time, and it's the image of Jesus high up on the crucifix. So essentially, you have Jesus who is looking at his own future death at that moment. So it's very, very powerful to stand in between those two spaces in that room. And ultimately, in the midst of all of that human drama, because we are really, and this is something that you should take advantage of in this exhibition, you have the opportunity to gaze into the faces of all of those 12 apostles. Faces that Leonardo went and studied. He studied faces. He studied people. He wrote about his constant study of people because he wants each one of those expressions to represent a human reality. That in those 12 men, we can find our own reactions, disbelief, denial, confusion, anger, all of those different ways of reacting to the sacred in our lives. We can look at that and see who we identify with. And amazingly enough, it doesn't always have to be the same person. And so imagine those friars who were in there every day, wondering that day, am I more like Judas? Maybe today I'm a little bit like Matthew. Or maybe I could be tomorrow a little bit more like James. So this idea of trying to find ourselves in this reaction to this extraordinary moment that's being put out in front of us. But ultimately, all of the human that we see in this painting, whether it's the careful still life detail of the objects on the table, whether it's the painstakingly crafted faces and reactions of the apostles, we are always brought back to Christ. But you'll notice that behind Christ's head, he chose not to put a halo, but an open window. And that open window that emanates light, the open window functions as a halo for Christ. And a promise that even though this moment begins the next 36 hours of torture, torment, suffering, anguish, and death, that beyond that, there is light. Beyond that, there is peace. And that is always what Leonardo wanted us to understand, that even though he's fascinated by capturing this very human moment of betrayal, of denial, of consternation, of loneliness, of Christ's intense loneliness, isolated by himself in that triangle, that suffering that Jesus will undergo is so that all of us can look beyond, we can perceive, we can enjoy the perspective, we can look through and see the eternal, to see the promise of eternity that is meant for each and every one of us. And this is really the joy of the beauty of art, where Leonardo takes one of the most terrible moments in human history, the announcement of the betrayal of God himself, and yet he telescopes it through beauty into eternal beauty. I hope you enjoy this incredible experience of being able to see that painting, perhaps even better than you could even in its museum in Milan. You'll have more time to spend with it. You only have 15 minutes when you're in Milan. You'll be able to look at details that perhaps are harder to see. But nonetheless, I also hope you will all make your way eventually to Leonardo's original Last Supper, where you can stand in that space between Jesus' betrayal and his crucifixion, and then come back to see the promise of eternal life that Christ offers us. Happy viewing.